Ambassador Jake Morrison stood at the center of the massive council chamber and felt the weight of 47 different species watching his every move. The air recyclers hummed quietly as they worked to provide breathable atmosphere for creatures that had evolved on dozens of different worlds. Some breathed oxygen like humans, while others needed methane or ammonia or stranger gases that Jake could not even pronounce. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering that allowed all these different life forms to exist in the same space without killing each other. Jake had been Earth's representative to the Galactic Council for 12 years, and in that time he had seen more conflicts and arguments than most diplomats saw in their entire careers. Today would be different, though, because today he was not here to solve problems or make peace between angry aliens. Today he was here to deliver a message that would change everything. The Zephyrian delegate clicked his sharp mandibles together in the way his species did when they were nervous. The clicking sound echoed off the crystal walls and made several of the more sensitive species flinch. To Jake's left, the crystalline representative shifted her glowing form from blue to purple, which meant she was confused about something. Behind them, the massive bulk of the rock-thrower ambassador sat perfectly still, as his species always did, but Jake knew the big creature was listening to every word. Captain Lisa Hayes watched from the observation gallery high above the main floor, where she had a clear view of everything happening below. Her uniform bore the insignia of the Earth Defense Fleet, and she commanded 3 ships that were currently docked at the station. Those ships were loaded with every human diplomat, scientist, and military advisor who had been working in council space for the past 3 centuries. Lisa's orders were simple, but she knew following them would be the hardest thing she had ever done as a military officer. The great chamber had been built to impress visitors with its size and beauty, but Jake had long since stopped being impressed by alien architecture. He had seen too many wars start in rooms just like this one, where species that should have been friends ended up as enemies because they could not understand each other. The humans had spent 300 years preventing those wars, and Jake was tired of it. "Honored representatives," Jake began, and his voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. Thanks to the translation systems that converted his words into the languages and thought patterns of every species present, I stand before you today not as a mediator or peacekeeper, but as the voice of humanity delivering our final decision regarding membership in this council. The Aquatic Federation's representative made a sound like water flowing over rocks, which meant she was becoming agitated. The insectoid hive mind speaker remained perfectly motionless, but Jake knew the creature was transmitting everything he said back to the billions of individuals that made up its collective consciousness. Every species had their own way of showing emotion or concern, and Jake had learned to read them all over his long years of service. "For 3 centuries my people have served this council with dedication and honor," Jake continued as he looked around the chamber at faces and forms that ranged from almost human to completely alien. "We have mediated your disputes when ancient enemies could not speak to each other without violence. We have provided technological solutions when your different biologies made cooperation impossible. We have maintained peace between species that had been fighting for thousands of years before humans ever left their home planet. The warrior clans of Vorthek had representatives who looked like giant cats with opposable thumbs, and they were known for their quick tempers. Jake could see them flexing their claws, which meant they were getting angry about something he had said. The Peaceful Collective's ambassador was a being made of pure energy who glowed brighter when excited, and Jake noticed the creature's light was definitely getting stronger. "We answered every call for help, whether it came from the largest empire or the smallest colony world," Jake said as he remembered all the times human ships had rushed across the galaxy to stop wars or prevent genocides. "We shared our technology freely, even when other species kept their advances secret. We opened our worlds to refugees from every conflict and our hospitals to wounded from every species. We did these things because we believed in the principles this council claims to represent." From her position in the gallery, Lisa Hayes felt a cold knot forming in her stomach as she listened to Jake's words. She had been present at dozens of battles where human soldiers died protecting alien civilians who had never asked for their help, She had seen human medics treating wounded enemies while their own people bled to death waiting for treatment. The galaxy had taken everything humans were willing to give and then asked for more. However, Jake said, and his voice became harder than steel, we have come to understand that this council does not want partners or equals. You want servants who will solve your problems while you continue making the same mistakes over and over again. You want us to prevent wars while you refuse to address the causes of those wars. You want us to maintain peace while you actively work to undermine it. The chamber erupted into noise as representatives from different species began arguing with each other and with Jake. The Zephyrian delegate clicked his mandibles so fast it sounded like machine gun fire. The crystalline representative flashed through colors so quickly she looked like a living rainbow. The HiveMind speaker finally moved for the first time in hours, and Jake knew that meant billions of individual creatures were all trying to communicate at once. You have grown comfortable letting humans handle every crisis while you pursue your own interests. Jake shouted over the noise, and his words cut through the chaos like a knife. You criticize our methods while depending on our results? You call us primitive while begging us to save you from your own advanced civilizations. You demand we respect your cultures while showing no respect for ours. The arguing stopped as suddenly as it had started because every species in the chamber understood that something fundamental was changing. They had never heard a human ambassador speak with such anger or disappointment. For 3 centuries, humans had been patient teachers and careful diplomats who always found ways to make everyone happy. Today was different, and they all knew it. Therefore, Jake said into the sudden silence, humanity hereby withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately. We will honor existing trade agreements for 1 standard year to give you time to make other arrangements. After that, all human presence will be removed from council space and we will return to our own systems. You will have to solve your own problems from now on. Jake Morrison turned and walked toward the exit without another word, leaving behind 46 species, who suddenly realized they had no idea how to govern a galaxy without human help. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison walked out of the council chamber, and Commander Ryan Brooks was beginning to understand just how much the galaxy depended on human peacekeepers. His ship Liberty floated at the edge of the Terran exclusion zone, where Earth's government had ordered all human vessels to remain unless directly threatened. From his position, Ryan could see the flashes of weapons fire lighting up the darkness between 2 fleets that should have been trading partners instead of trying to kill each other. The warrior clans of Vorthek had always been aggressive, but they usually kept their violence contained to ritual combat and sports competitions. The peaceful collective of Serenity Station lived up to their name by avoiding conflict whenever possible and focusing on art and philosophy instead of warfare. These 2 species had been neighbors for over 1,000 years without any major problems, because human diplomats had always been available to resolve disputes before they became serious. Lieutenant Amy Foster monitored the communications channels from her station on the Liberty's bridge, and what she heard made her sick to her stomach. The collective ships were sending desperate pleas for help to anyone who would listen while Vorthak raiders destroyed their cargo vessels one by one. The attack had started over mining rights to an asteroid field that both sides claimed, but neither side had bothered to properly survey until humans were no longer available to do it for them. Sir, we are receiving direct communications from Collective Admiral Zenhai, Amy reported to Ryan with barely controlled emotion in her voice. She is offering massive trade concessions and exclusive technology sharing agreements if we will intervene to protect their civilian transports. Ryan watched another collective ship explode on his main screen and felt his hands clench into fists. The peaceful collective had criticized human military tactics for decades as being too aggressive and unnecessarily violent. They had insisted that all disputes could be resolved through calm discussion and mutual understanding. Now their philosophy was getting them slaughtered by enemies who had never shared their peaceful beliefs. What are our current orders, Lieutenant? Ryan asked, even though he already knew the answer. Observe and document only, sir, Amy replied with disgust clear in her voice. No intervention under any circumstances. All requests for assistance are to be logged and forwarded to Earth Command, but we are forbidden from taking any action. The Vorthak ships moved like hunting cats as they surrounded the remaining collective vessels. Ryan had fought alongside Vorthak warriors in the past and knew they were honorable fighters who usually respected rules of engagement. Today they were behaving more like pirates than soldiers because there were no human observers present to witness their actions. Without human oversight, many species were discovering that their supposed allies had very different ideas about acceptable behavior. Back on Earth, President Helen Carter sat in the Situation Room deep beneath the Capitol building and watched reports streaming in from across the galaxy. 17 separate conflicts had broken out in the 3 months since humanity's withdrawal, and the number was growing every day. Species that had lived in peace for centuries were suddenly finding reasons to fight each other over resources, territory, and old grievances that everyone had assumed were forgotten. General Peter Walsh placed another stack of reports on the table in front of President Carter, and every single page contained requests for human intervention. The Aquatic Federation wanted human mediators to resolve a trade dispute with the desert nomads. The Silicon-based collective was asking for human technical advisors to help them communicate with biological species. Even the energy beings who had always claimed to be superior to physical life forms were begging for human ambassadors to help them understand why their neighbors were suddenly hostile. Madam President, the situation is deteriorating faster than our worst-case projections predicted, General Walsh said as he pointed to a galaxy-wide map that showed conflict zones marked in red. Intelligence reports suggest that most species never developed their own diplomatic corps because they always relied on human mediators. They literally do not know how to talk to each other without our help. Helen Carter had been a senator when humanity first joined the Galactic Council 3 centuries ago, and she remembered the hope everyone felt about joining a community of peaceful civilizations. The reality had been very different as humans quickly discovered that most alien species were peaceful only because they avoided contact with anyone they might disagree with. Humans had become the glue holding galactic civilization together, and now that glue was dissolving on the former council station, temporary leader Zektar of the Hive Mind tried desperately to maintain order among delegates who seemed determined to blame each other for every problem in the galaxy. The station itself was falling apart because human engineers were no longer available to maintain the complex systems that kept 47 different species alive in the same facility. Emergency repairs were being attempted by Zephyrian technicians, who understood crystal technology but had no idea how to work with the metal components that humans had installed. The mammals always knew what words to use when speaking to different species. Zektar transmitted to the collective consciousness that linked billions of individual creatures across hive mind space. They understood that crystalline beings think in mathematical concepts while energy creatures communicate through frequency modulation. We never learned these skills because humans were always available to translate for us. The Aquatic Federation's representative had been trying to explain her species' position on territorial waters for 3 hours, but the desert nomads kept interpreting her fluid speech patterns as signs of weakness rather than diplomatic courtesy. Without human translators present, both sides were becoming increasingly frustrated, and the discussion was rapidly turning into an argument about which species was more evolutionarily advanced. Meanwhile, warrior clan delegates were sharpening their claws on the conference table while peaceful collective ambassadors meditated in corners, trying to avoid any behavior that might be interpreted as aggressive. The insectoid representatives communicated only through chemical signals that most other species found either incomprehensible or actively offensive. Every conversation became a potential diplomatic incident because nobody understood how to talk to anyone else. Dr. Kevin Martinez had spent 40 years studying alien psychology from his research station at the edge of human space, and his reports painted a grim picture of what was happening across the galaxy. Each species had evolved unique ways of thinking that made perfect sense within their own culture, but created massive misunderstandings when they tried to communicate with other life forms. Humans were apparently the only species that had developed multiple competing thought systems within a single civilization, which gave them the flexibility to understand how aliens might think differently. We were not just mediators, Kevin explained in his daily report to Earth Command. We were cognitive bridges allowing incompatible minds to find common ground. Without that bridge, most species cannot even begin to understand each other, much less cooperate on complex problems. 6 months after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, the first cargo ships began floating dead in space because their crews could no longer navigate the complex web of territorial boundaries that different alien species had established. Captain Danny Pierce commanded the cargo vessel New Frontier as one of the last human ships, still operating in Council space under contracts that would expire in another 6 months. From his bridge, he watched dozens of alien freighters sitting motionless at the edge of insectoid territory because their crews were afraid to request passage through space controlled by creatures they had never learned to communicate with properly. The galactic economy had been built around trade routes that connected species too different from each other to establish direct diplomatic or commercial relationships. Human merchants and diplomats had spent 3 centuries learning the cultural requirements and communication protocols needed to do business with every known species. They knew that crystalline beings required mathematical proof of fair exchange, RATES, while energy creatures needed frequency-based authentication codes. The Aquatic Federation insisted on complex water purity ceremonies before any negotiations, while desert nomads demanded proof that trading partners had sufficient survival skills to deserve respect. Lieutenant Claire Adams monitored the communication channels from her position as Danny's first officer and the reports she heard painted a picture of economic collapse spreading across the galaxy like a disease. The shipping lanes between major industrial worlds were becoming impassable as species that had cooperated for centuries suddenly began viewing each other as potential threats. Without human escorts to guarantee safe passage, many alien crews were simply refusing to enter space, controlled by species they did not understand. "Captain, the situation is getting worse every day," Claire reported as she reviewed the latest intelligence summaries. "The route between the gas giant consortium and the Rocky World Alliance has been completely blocked for 2 weeks now. Neither side will allow the other ships through their territory, and both sides are demanding human arbitration that is no longer available." Danny had been trading in alien space for 20 years and had seen how much work went into maintaining peaceful relationships between species that thought in completely different ways. Humans had not just been translators of language, but translators of entire worldviews and belief systems. They helped species understand why their neighbors behaved in ways that seemed strange or threatening when viewed from outside their own cultural context. On the industrial world of Gamma Forge chief engineer, Susan Wells supervised the shutdown of manufacturing facilities that had produced standardized equipment for dozens of different species. The factories had been designed by human engineers who understood how to create products that could be safely used by creatures with wildly different biologies and technological preferences. Without that knowledge, the remaining alien staff found themselves unable to maintain production lines that had operated smoothly for decades. "The problem is not just technical," Susan explained to Zekai, the Zephyrian administrator who was attempting to take over operations. "The Silicon-based collective designs their equipment using quantum resonance principles that are completely incompatible with the electromagnetic systems preferred by biological species. Humans spent generations learning how to bridge those gaps and create hybrid technologies that everyone could use." The tentacled engineers from Epsilon Prime had arrived at the factory expecting to find equipment they could operate with their specialized manipulator appendages, but instead discovered that most of the machinery required humanoid hands and fingers. The floating gas bag creatures from the cloud cities needed atmospheric controls that the factory's life support systems could not provide. Every species had evolved different solutions to the same basic problems, and without human coordination, those solutions were proving incompatible with each other. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out as the infrastructure of galactic civilization began falling apart. The communication networks that connected different star systems had been maintained by human technicians who understood the variety of signal formats and transmission methods used by different species. The transportation hubs that allowed beings to travel safely between worlds with different atmospheric and gravitational conditions were closing down because alien staff could not operate the complex environmental controls that humans had installed and maintained. Dr. Kevin Martinez watched the collapse accelerate from his research station and filed daily reports documenting the breakdown of interspecies cooperation. His 40 years of studying alien psychology had given him unique insights into why the galaxy was fracturing so quickly. Each species had evolved specialized mental processes that made them extremely efficient at solving certain types of problems, but completely unable to understand how other species approach those same challenges. The hive mind species think collectively and cannot comprehend individual decision-making, Kevin explained in his report to Earth Command. The individual focused species like the desert nomads cannot understand how collective consciousness works. The energy beings view time differently than physical creatures, and the silicon-based life forms operate on geological timescales that biological species find incomprehensible. Humans were the only species flexible enough to shift between all these different modes of thinking. The breakdown was not just technological and economic, but psychological as well. Species that had worked together peacefully for centuries were beginning to view each other with suspicion and fear. The Aquatic Federation started hoarding water-rich asteroids because they were convinced that land-based species were planning to steal their resources. The desert nomads began stockpiling rare minerals because they believed the other species were trying to make them economically dependent and vulnerable. Meanwhile, the peaceful collective discovered that their philosophy of avoiding conflict only worked when someone else was available to handle the difficult conversations and tough decisions. Without human diplomats to manage relationships with more aggressive species, the collective found themselves being pushed around and exploited by neighbors who had always seemed reasonable. When humans were present to moderate their behavior, the warrior clans of Vorthek had always respected human military prowess and had moderated their own aggressive tendencies out of concern for human opinion. With humans no longer present to observe their actions, many clan warriors were reverting to older, more brutal traditions that had been abandoned centuries ago. Honor duels became death matches, and territorial disputes escalated into planetary bombardments because there were no human peacekeepers present to enforce civilized rules of engagement. Captain Tony Richardson received emergency broadcasts from across the galaxy as he led a small fleet of human vessels toward the edge of Council space. Every message was a desperate plea for human intervention in conflicts that were spiraling out of control. Species that had criticized human methods for being too direct or too aggressive were now begging for exactly those qualities as their own. Diplomatic approaches proved completely inadequate for managing galactic-scale problems. 1 year after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, the first desperate delegation of alien representatives arrived at the human embassy on Mars carrying offers that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Ambassador Tony Richardson sat across from 12 of the most powerful species leaders in the galaxy and listened to them admit things they had never been willing to say when humans were still part of the council. The meeting room was designed to accommodate different atmospheric and gravitational needs, but even with all the environmental controls working perfectly, the alien delegates looked uncomfortable and desperate. Q. Athal of the Crystal Hegemony spoke first, and her normally perfect crystalline form flickered with stress patterns that Tony had learned to recognize during his years of diplomatic service. The crystal beings were known for their logical thinking and emotional control, but today Cthulhu seemed on the verge of what humans might call a nervous breakdown. Her species had always claimed that their mathematical approach to problem-solving was superior to human intuition and creativity, but the past year had proven them tragically wrong. Ambassador Richardson, you must understand that we never realized how much our civilization depended on human cognitive abilities, Cthulhu said, and her voice carried harmonics of desperation that her species rarely displayed. Our people think in pure mathematical concepts, and we cannot comprehend the emotional and intuitive thought processes that biological species use. Without human translators, we cannot communicate effectively with most of the galaxy. Veltar of the warrior clan sat beside her looking like a giant cat that had been defeated in battle. His species took great pride in their strength and independence. But the past year had humbled them in ways they had never experienced before. The clans had always viewed diplomacy as a weakness and had relied on human mediators to handle negotiations while they focused on what they considered more important matters like combat training and territorial expansion. We mocked your adaptability. As a sign of evolutionary confusion, Veltar admitted in his claws, retracted in a gesture of submission that no human had ever seen from a warrior clan representative. We believe that our focused warrior culture made us stronger than species that tried to be good at many different things. We were wrong. Your ability to think like everyone else was not weakness, but the greatest strength in the galaxy. The hive mind representative Zektar had brought a portable communication device that allowed the collective consciousness of billions of individuals to participate in the conversation. The device hummed and glowed as countless minds tried to process information and reach consensus, but Tony could see that even the vast intelligence of the hive was struggling with concepts they had never needed to understand before. Our collective intelligence is powerful when all minds think alike, Zektar transmitted through the device. But we cannot understand species that make individual decisions or creatures that change their minds based on emotion rather than logic. Humans were the only species that could bridge the gap between collective and individual thinking. Without that bridge, we are isolated from most of galactic civilization. Tony listened patiently as each representative explained how their species had fundamental limitations that prevented them from interacting effectively with other forms of life. The energy beings could not relate to physical creatures who were limited by matter and time. The aquatic species could not understand how land-based life forms thought about space and territory. The silicon-based collective viewed biological life as too short-lived and chaotic to be worth serious consideration. Each species had evolved along a single path that made them very good at certain things, but completely unable to understand or appreciate different approaches to existence. Humans were apparently the only species that had developed multiple competing systems of thought within their own civilization. They had experience being warlike and peaceful, individual and collective, logical and emotional, which gave them the flexibility to understand how other species might think and feel. Colonel Brad Murphy had been leading reconnaissance missions into former council space for the past 6 months, and his reports painted a picture of civilization in complete collapse. Entire star systems had gone dark as species retreated into isolation rather than risk conflicts they could not resolve. The grand trade networks that had connected thousands of worlds had been reduced to small local exchanges between species that shared similar biologies and thought processes. It is worse than our most pessimistic projections, Brad reported to Earth Command during his latest briefing. The gentle shepherds of Harmony Prime have been completely enslaved by the dominant hierarchy because they had no way to resist aggressive tactics without human protection. 3 minor species have been wiped out entirely in resource wars that could have been prevented with basic mediation. The galaxy is reverting to a pre-civilization state. Back on Earth, President Helen Carter faced mounting pressure from multiple directions as the full scope of the galactic crisis became clear. Humanitarian groups demanded that Earth intervene to prevent genocide and suffering, while isolationist factions argued that alien problems were not humanity's responsibility. The military warned that any intervention would require deploying the entire Earth Defense Fleet and accepting massive casualties from day one. General Peter Walsh presented intelligence reports showing that 46 different species were now engaged in active conflicts with each other, while the few remaining peaceful species huddled in their home systems hoping to avoid notice. The Galactic Council had officially dissolved after the Central Station was destroyed in a terrorist attack by unknown parties. Several attempts to establish replacement governments had failed, within weeks as different species proved unable to cooperate without human oversight. If we return to Council space now, we will be walking into a war zone where every species views every other species as a potential threat, General Walsh explained during a closed-door briefing. We would need to establish military occupation of hundreds of star systems and maintain peacekeeping forces on thousands of worlds. The cost in human lives would be enormous. The alien delegation continued to wait on Mars as Earth's government debated their response. The offers on the table included exclusive trade agreements worth trillions of credits, territorial concessions that would give humanity control of entire star systems, and technology transfers that could advance human civilization by centuries. Some species were even offering to serve as client states under human leadership in exchange for protection and guidance, but Tony Richardson knew that behind all the desperate offers lay a fundamental problem that none of the alien species were willing to acknowledge. They wanted human help, but they still refused to admit that their own limitations and prejudices were the root cause of their problems. They expected humans to fix everything while they continued thinking and behaving exactly as they always had. 2 years after humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, Captain Jack Thompson piloted the exploration vessel Horizon through what had once been the busiest shipping corridor in known space. The silence was deafening compared to the constant chatter of cargo ships and passenger transports that used to fill these space lanes. His mission was to conduct the first comprehensive survey of former Council space since the withdrawal, and what he found exceeded even the worst predictions that Earth's analysts had made. Admiral Kate Phillips received Jack's reports at Fleet headquarters on Luna, and each transmission painted a darker picture of galactic civilization's collapse. The Nexus Prime system that had once housed over 4 billion beings from dozens of different species was now completely lifeless. Sensor readings showed massive radiation signatures consistent with planet-cracking weapons being used on all 4 inhabited worlds. Someone had decided that total destruction was preferable to sharing the system with their enemies. Admiral We detecting no life signs in the entire system, Jack reported as his ship completed its orbital survey of what had been the galaxy's most important trade hub. All major cities have been reduced to radioactive craters, and the orbital stations have been completely destroyed. There are debris fields consistent with a massive fleet battle, but no survivors and no indication of who was responsible. The survey continued through system after system that had once been centers of galactic commerce and culture. The Harmony worlds where dozens of species had lived together in carefully managed communities were now divided into single-species enclaves, surrounded by military fortifications. The great library of Zenthara that had contained the collected knowledge of 47 civilizations had been burned to the ground during a dispute over which species had the right to control access to information. Back on Earth, Dr. Kevin Martinez completed his final analysis of the galactic collapse, and his conclusions were more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Humanity had not simply been mediators or peacekeepers, but had served as the evolutionary bridge that allowed dozens of incompatible species to coexist in the same galaxy. Without that bridge, the aliens had reverted to the territorial and aggressive behaviors that had dominated their species before they achieved space travel. Every other species in the galaxy evolved along a single developmental path, Dr. Martinez explained to the Global Assembly during his presentation. They developed one way of thinking, one social structure, one approach to solving problems. Humans are unique because we evolved multiple competing systems within our own civilization. We have experience being warriors and pacifist individualists, and collectivists, logical thinkers and emotional decision-makers. That diversity gave us the ability to understand and communicate with species that were completely alien to each other. The final alien delegation had arrived on Earth, itself led by the few surviving moderate leaders who had managed to maintain some stability in their home regions. They came not as proud representatives of advanced civilizations, but as refugees, seeking sanctuary from the chaos that had consumed their galaxy. Zektar of the hive mind carried credentials from a coalition of desperate species, authorizing him to make an offer that would have been unthinkable before the withdrawal. President Carter stood before the combined leadership of Earth as they debated humanity's response to the most extraordinary proposal in galactic history. The surviving alien species were offering complete subordination to human authority in exchange for the stability that only human leadership seemed capable of providing. They wanted to become client states governed by human administrators and protected by human military forces. The question before us is not whether we have the ability to restore order to the galaxy. President Carter addressed the Global Assembly as representatives from every nation and colony world listened intently. The question is whether we want to accept the responsibility of ruling over species that have proven incapable of governing themselves. They are asking us not for partnership or cooperation, but for dominion over their entire civilization. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within human society about their role in galactic affairs. Some argued that humanity had a moral obligation to help species that were suffering because of their own limitations. Others insisted that the aliens needed to learn hard lessons about the consequences of their prejudices and dependence. Military leaders warned that establishing human rule over the galaxy would require permanent occupation forces and constant vigilance against rebellion. Jake Morrison had been recalled from retirement to serve as humanity's first galactic governor if Earth decided to accept the alien proposal. He stood on the observation deck of the orbital station where the Global Assembly was meeting and looked down at the blue and green world that had given birth to the only species capable of holding galactic civilization together. The irony was not lost on him that by walking away from the Council, humanity had proven that they were the only species the galaxy trusted to lead it. "We spent 3 centuries trying to teach them to work together," Jake said to Admiral Phillips, who had joined him at the viewing port. "We gave them every opportunity to develop their own diplomatic abilities and conflict resolution skills. Instead, they became more dependent on us with each passing year. Now they want us to take complete control because they finally understand that they cannot survive without us." The final vote was closer than many had expected, but ultimately the Global Assembly decided to accept the alien proposal with strict conditions. Humanity would establish a new galactic government with humans in all major leadership positions, but the alien species would be required to demonstrate genuine efforts toward understanding and cooperation. Any species that reverted to their old patterns of aggression or isolation would lose human protection and support. Jake Morrison prepared for his return to the stars as the first human leader of a galactic empire that nobody had wanted but everybody needed. The alien species had learned too late that their greatest strength lay not in their individual specializations, but in their ability to work together despite their differences. Humans had always known this because they had been forced to learn it on their own world where multiple competing cultures and belief systems had to find ways to coexist. As humanity's ships began returning to former council space, they carried with them the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory came not from demanding respect, but from being willing to walk away when that respect was not freely given. The galaxy had chosen to follow humanity not because humans were stronger or smarter than other species, but because they were the only ones who truly understood what it meant to live in peace with those who were completely different from themselves.